Everybody, Questwise here, and can we just talk about this for a minute? Conan and the Battle of the Black Stone. Oh, this is a 4-part, well, 5-part, because the first one I just showed you is the Free Comic Book Day sort of intro into this storyline, this event from Titan Comics. Jim Zub, Chris Butera, Rich Starkings. Jonas Scharf. I don't even know where to begin with this. If you've watched the channel for a while, you know I am a huge scholar of all things Robert Howard. I discovered Robert Howard a little bit later than your average fan. I just turned 49 years old this year. And I started reading fantasy when I was about 12, 13, somewhere in there. But I started with The Lord of the Rings. I started with The Sword of Shannara, the Terry Brooks stuff. That was my first intro into sort of fantasy. And I had thought that all fantasy was, at that time, sort of the same, right? That's high fantasy trope. It wasn't until I was later in high school, probably my junior, maybe senior year, where I met a guy. I don't know if we'd really call each other friends. We were acquaintances. We knew who each other was, who we were, and we were classmates. But we never really hung out. We weren't really like friends. But I noticed one day he was reading a book, and it had a very dynamic fantasy cover on it. And I asked him what he was reading. And it happened to be a Robert Howard story about Conan the Barbarian. And I looked everywhere. I come from a very small town in northern Michigan, who we had one used bookstore, and that was about it. The closest other bookstores, or major bookstore, Borders Book or Walden Books, was in our mall, but it was like the next town over. So I got to that next town maybe once a month, and I began to scour for Robert Howard. Talking late 80s, early 90s, and found nothing. Eventually, I found a copy of some Robert Howard works, and I instantly fell in love. A beautiful, well-written story, fantasy, but not a fantasy that I had ever encountered before at that point in my life. A very humanocentric, very gritty, very dark fantasy with magic, which was not like casting fireballs and not like throwing lightning bolts, right? This was magic that had consequences. And a story about a character who was an everyman. He was a thief. He was a pirate. He was a warrior. He was intelligent. He was swarthy. He was sly. And the writing just, there was something about this writing and that I wanted more of. And it wasn't until much later, when I went off to college, that I was able to discover much more of Robert Howard's works. Even beyond Conan, or bleeding into like Call the Conqueror, and some of his other stories. A few years ago, while I was working for Borders here in the neighboring town over, I came across these. Right? These are done by Del Rey. I believe they're still available, but what they did is they were able to take all of the original Robert Howard stories. There are 3 volumes of just Conan himself. There's a Call the Conqueror. There's many, many others. And I believe these are all available. You can find them on Amazon, but I believe these are still in print. But not only did they collect just all of the stories that he had written, but a lot of the sort of snippets and short stories and unfinished tales that Robert Howard had written. And I began to read all of them. I poured my heart and soul into these stories. And while some were better than others, they all sort of encompassed his technique, his style, which I had never encountered before. And from there, I began to read other types of sort of dark, swarthy fantasy, things like the Gore series by John Norman, I think was his name. I began to read H.P. Lovecraft. I began to read a lot more of these sort of stories born out of the pulp era. And I fell in love with all of them, but something always sort of brought me back to Robert Howard. Now, Robert Howard's been known as he's been deemed, sort of tagged, with the title of the father of sword and sorcery. And I agree with that. I think that there were a lot of things that he borrowed from that were predecessors of his, but I think that he was really the one that sort of incorporated all of those ideas, this sort of mix of low fantasy mixed with historical stories, with ideas of horror, and he made that sort of sword and sorcery genre that we know it today his own, and gave it a new life. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here about Robert Howard and how the fact that most of his stuff never became popular until way after he had already passed away. What I wanted to talk to you about today is this: the Battle of the Blackstone by Titan Comics, written by Jim Zub. But this story is interesting because it's covered in like I said, 4 parts, 4 main issues, 5 if you count this. I would definitely count this. This is sort of a very great introduction into this idea. At one point, Robert Howard and H.P. Lovecraft began this relationship where they would send letters back and forth to each other, and they would talk about things, and they talk about characters, and they would talk about ideas and genres. And it was really sort of the first shared world environment. Robert Howard had told Lovecraft, "Hey, I wrote about this character. Feel free, if you like his story, if you like this sort of thing, to go ahead and use this character in your writings." And Lovecraft was the same way, vice versa. Howard came up with this thing called the Black Stone, this icon, this idol, this sigil, if you will, that was immensely evil, and whoever looked upon it, it sort of infected their lives for the rest of the time that they had lived. And what Jim Zub and the creative team over at Titan have done is they've brought in characters like Conan, obviously. They brought in characters like Dark Agnes, Solomon Kane. They brought in Brissa, who were, if you're familiar with the Conan stories, you'll know her very well. James Allison, who I believe is very much a character that Robert Howard created that was basically him, his literary sort of personification. El Borak, right? The stories of El Borak. John Conrad, John Kierwin. I showed you Solomon Kane, but I actually showed you the wrong one. This is the Solomon Kane stories. This is the horror stories of Robert Howard, who just happens to have Solomon Kane on the cover, where you can find stories where he mentions the Black Stone, where he mentions this sigil, this evil incarnate thing. in all my time of being a reader and a fan of this kind of literature and of literature in general, there's this sort of, and Stephen King will tell you this himself, the scariest thing that you can ever imagine is the thing that's scratching behind the door that you never get to see. Because your mind will create what's terrifying about that thing that you never get to see behind the door. Your imagination will sort of build that up. What's terrifying for you? And I feel like that was kind of a thing with Lovecraft and Howard. And Lovecraft used these crazy explanations of what things looked like and what things sounded like and smelled like that sort of defy explanation. And that's simply how he would put it. It's undescribable, but then would try to describe it, right? It's this crazy ideas. And I think Robert Howard was a big fan of that idea, that the scariest thing that you can imagine is the thing you never see. And so this idea of the black stone, of this sigil, of this icon, is something that, like, while Jim Zub and the creative team at Titan Comics show you what the sigil looks like, it's almost as if you're sort of getting the story of what this thing has done to their lives through their experience. Not so much it's a picture of an eye. Let's see if I can find a picture of it for you. Yeah, here we go. Right, this is the sigil. This is the black stone. Right, it's etched on this black stone. And while it's just a sigil, just a symbol of evil, of some kind, and it's never really sort of thoroughly explained in the story what it is. It's sort of more of an effect on how it has impacted the characters in their lives. And this is a kind of a crazy story, which brings Conan, and it brings Solomon Kane and James Allison and El Borak and stuff from all their respective worlds. They're all having the shared experience of the black stone, and then bringing them together to combat, to try to face this thing together, whatever this thing might be. And I don't want to spoil it for you. I'm not going to tell you what the thing is. I'm not going to tell you more about the black stone. I'm not even going to tell you about how they all come together. But it is brilliantly told. It is wonderfully written. I truly believe if Robert Howard were alive today, he would be proud of the Battle of Blackstone. Now, Mr. Zub has been writing for Titan Comics in the sort of Conan line for quite a while now, and you can see that in the sort of normal Conan line that they have going on, as well as the Savage Sword of Conan. He's contributed to some of that as well. And if you don't know, the Savage Sword of Conan is sort of the magazine-sized, multiple short visual stories, as well as regular short stories, literary short stories, as opposed to being a full, just regular comic book. Very interesting. You should definitely go check them out. But I think that Jim Zub stands on the shoulders of giants, right? There are people that have told Conan tales for decades, outside of Robert Howard's tales themselves, and this pastiche of trying to emulate Howard's writing style. And some have done pretty well. Some have come pretty close, in my opinion. This is truly all my opinion. But I think this story, this Battle of Blackstone in these 4 parts, is probably the closest thing that I have seen that I would call, and I hate the word pastiche because it sounds dirty, right? It sounds, at least to me, it sounds like, oh, I'm ripping off this writer's stuff. But I think Howard was the kind of person that wanted to share these characters. He wanted other people to enjoy them. And I think he would have enjoyed seeing how some of these people took his creations, his worlds, his characters, and ran with them. And now I will admit, and again, even this is coming from a true fan of Conan the character himself, as well as all the other characters of Robert Howard's stuff, that some have done it better than others. Sometimes you just, you have to be a certain special type of writer with a certain special type of mindset to really capture what Conan is. And there, I've read a lot of the stuff that has been like way off in left field. But I've read a lot of stuff that's been really good. A lot of the comics. Roy Thomas's run, specifically. But, so Mr. Zub is standing on the shoulder of people who have gone before him. And I feel, and I've not met Mr. Zub at all, but I know that from watching some of the sort of interviews with him and some of the things that he's written outside of the comic book world, that he's a true fan and more than a fan, but a scholar of Robert Howard's works, and a true, really wants to encapsulate what it is that Howard sort of had, that special spark, that sort of particular view of writing characters and sword and sorcery itself. And I think he's really, really close. I think he's right there on the cusp of that great emulation of Robert Howard's works. I highly encourage you. The writing in this is amazing. The artwork is beautiful. It just flows very well. There are ups and downs and oh my God kind of moments, all in 4 issues. And I appreciate this very much, because other comics, other companies, sometimes when they have and I would call this a major event. It's sort of a world shattering kind of event. A lot of times other comic publishers will go crazy with that type of an idea. And you'll have like 20 comics in the main line of whatever they're doing, and then all these offshoots and these one-shots, and these, it sometimes gets out of hand and it gets crazy. And if you're a comic book fan and you've been reading for a while, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some are very well done, and some of them just get out of hand. For them, for Titan Comics and Mr. Zub and the creative team there, to encapsulate everything into 5 issues was great. Was a true masterpiece of writing technique. I studied a lot of. I've studied writing, and I've studied. I've written some stuff myself. If you watched the channel for a while, you know I've done some game design. I've done some fiction writing. I've done some nonfiction writing. And so to be able to see the things that I studied, the ideas of sort of encapsulating a story into a small package, and how to do it well, I feel like got nailed in this series perfectly. And I can't wait to see. I heard of the rumors that we might see some Dark Agnes comics. We might see some more Solomon Kane. I would love to see more Elborak. I love Elborak. And there are a few characters that I had mentioned before that sort of, I don't think they got overlooked, but I don't think that maybe they just don't fit into this story, the story that they were trying to tell. But there are other characters from Robert Howard that I would love to see Titan Comics take and do their sort of treatment with. But Conan and the Battle of the Black Stone. If you have not picked this up, please run to your friendly local comic book store and get your copies now. This one, the free comic book day one, I'm not sure. I'm sure you can find it online. It might be a little tougher to get in store because, it was free. They were just giving it away. You might be able to find some copies online. I would check some online retailers that you trust to see if you can get this. But it's not necessary to enjoy the normal series, the normal 4-part series, but definitely adds a richness to what this whole thing is and gets you a nice setup of exactly what's going to happen to your life when you incorporate and you get to read this story. I can't say enough great things about this. I've been loving everything that Titan has done with the regular Conan series, with the Savage Sword. I love the Savage Sword. I love the magazine format of things that they're doing over there, and this in particular was mind-blowing for me. For somebody who loves Robert Howard's writings, who loves Conan the character, who loves all of Robert Howard's characters, or what they're affectionately referring to as the Howard verse. Also, if you're a role player, if you play Dungeons and Dragons, if you play Call of Cthulhu, if you're a tabletop miniatures fan like Pulp Alley, any of that kind of stuff where you have sort of an agnostic setting that you can play, there are hundreds of ideas and story threads that you could mine for this, for your play groups, wherever it is you might be playing. My friends, until next time, I am Questwise. I urge you always to please stay safe wherever you are, and as always, game on.